name's Willow, and today I'm going to talk a bit about the narrative structures in the game Photopia, specifically concerning which methods are effective and ineffective for gameplay and storytelling. These methods typically concern mechanics and narrative as ineffective and effective respectively. In order to better understand how these aspects work, we must first address the basic game components of form and function. Structurally, Photopia is an ergodic game, meaning it relies on user input for the story to progress. Style, strategy, and mimesis in ergodic literature provides a good definition of ergodic literature in terms of Aarseth's acclaimed work, Cybertext. Quote, Espen Aarseth has been one of the main architects of an approach to video games that accounts for the resemblances to games as well as to literary forms. In Cybertext, one of the founding documents of game studies, Aarseth argues that the interactive experience common to video games can be found in other kinds of text as well, and typifies what he calls ergodic literature, in which non-trivial effort is required to allow the reader to traverse the text. In ergodic literature, the experience sequence of signs does not emerge in a fixed, predetermined order decided by the instigator of the work, but is instead one actualization among many potential routes within what we may call the event space of semiological possibility. To put it more simply, in certain kinds of texts, the reader makes choices that determine the sequence of signs that present themselves to be read. Ergodic literature may here be read as a story dependent on user participation, as the layout of the plot cannot be strictly predetermined. Even in instances of a single ending, there are typically many possible routes involved in finding the conclusion. To this end, let us first discuss the ineffective mechanical aspects in playing Photopia. As stated, ergodic games rely on interactive storytelling as the player's choices ultimately impact the path of the story. While Photopia does rely on textual exploration, it differs from typical ergodic games in its format as a parser-based unicursal labyrinth, without any real consequences or divergences in terms of the choices. In order to show this, let us first define what parser-based text and unicursal labyrinths are. Parser-based text is that in which the player parses information from what the game has given and uses words or context clues therein to access new information. Despite this apparent open to the imagination format, there is remarkably little player agency regarding the fundamental plot in this game, ultimately revealing itself to be a type of unicursal labyrinth. Aarseth provides a cohesive explanation of the differences between unicursal and multicursal in the following. Penelope Reed-Dube, in her excellent discussion of physical and metaphorical labyrinths of classical antiquity in the Middle Ages, distinguishes between two kinds of labyrinthine structure: the unicursal, where there is only one path winding and turning, usually towards the center, and the multicursal, where the maze wanderer faces a series of critical choices. Photopia's storyline exists as a unicursal labyrinth, as there is ultimately only one outcome the story could reach, being that Allie dies in a car collision while being driven home from her babysitting job. Where it differs from this original structure is that not only is there only one outcome, but also only one path. Despite the capacity of the player to input whichever actions they should choose, the game herds them in the proper direction, disallowing them from moving forward without the exact singly correct action, as you can see in the instance of resuscitating Allie. While ergodic systems do have paths involved in taking the player to the end, there are typically multiple paths in which to do so. This idea is supported by Miguel Carvalhais' Traversal Hermeneutics, the emergence of narrative in ergodic media, which states that human operators always develop an interpretive function similar to that we can find in more conventional media, where all decisions made by the reader only concern meaning. In the case of ergodic media and of artificial aesthetic artifacts, this interpretive function may be accompanied by three additional functions postulated by Aarseth: the explorative function, the configurative function, and the textonic function. All three of these functions ultimately influence the path the story takes through some means of exploration, navigation, or addition to the narrative respectively. Photopia takes on a seemingly textonic function, though the additions to the game are so specific that they would not vary between players, with very little agency involved in their processes, as the single path of the story was predetermined from the onset. Even in a unicursal structure, when decisions become ultimately meaningless, there are typically still different choices and paths that lead to the same conclusion. In other words, the player has apparent ability to influence the path of the narrative, when in truth there is no such power available. In terms of Photopia's lack of both choice and illusion, we can read this as the developer's intention concerning the meaning of the game itself as one of fatalism and helplessness regarding the nature of life, but mechanically, it is a weak structure for a game. The best example of this hurting is in the Crystal Labyrinth of Ali's fantasy realm. In the Crystal Labyrinth, the player is faced with the seemingly free choice to move north, south, east, or west. This freedom often becomes interrupted by a crystal wall blocking one of the paths, leaving 3 choices remaining. In this instance, we do appear to have choices. Given the traditional layout of mazes, one can assume there is only one exit and one path through the maze. The player will then attempt to solve the puzzle. While the layout does restrict agency to simple directions, it does fall in with the rules of the game of the labyrinth. As time goes on, the player becomes increasingly frustrated that they are unable to escape the maze, trying many different methods such as sticking to one direction, trying to outsmart the game by breaking a wall or tunneling, etc. After repeated failure, the game may give the player a clue about removing their spacesuit and having the cool breeze ruffling the feathers of your wings. It is eventually revealed that the only solution to the maze was to remove your spacesuit and fly out. There was, in fact, never any way for the player to make it out of the maze with logic or even by interacting with this setting at all. While this section is a well-executed representation of the whole game's structure and shows awareness of the single-task nature of the game, it is also the best example of a single path existing to escape a cyclical storyline and the frustration involved in no other paths being available. While it is a major point of the plot that the ending is singular and unavoidable, the procedures of this game make it a tedious journey, not so much through the plot itself, but through the mechanics of the game, as the player attempts to craft just the right verbiage to progress. Ultimately, these mechanics herd the player in such a way that only one action becomes possible despite the apparent freedom to choose and parse text, depicting not only the single ending, but the single possible path through the narrative one is meant to take. In the case of the Crystal Labyrinth, the solution was not even one of a puzzle, but of true fantasy as the playable character takes off her spacesuit and flies away. While this section does reflect a children's fantasy story, there was something supremely unsatisfying in the conclusion that there was no way to escape the maze while treating it as a puzzle. This creates the feeling that the player was not needed for any part of the story at all, as its narrative was predestined and rigid, reducing the player to an audience. These procedural issues tie into the base structure of the game and the problems with a strictly linear game with seemingly non-linear mechanics. Alongside the issues of parser-based unicursal narrative structures, the apparent non-linearity serves to confuse the player and discourage any investment in the story. By the time the disjointed sections are revealed to have direct connections, the player's attention has drifted and the confusion of the jumps has detracted from the emotional investment, given the difficulty in keeping track of the different perspectives. While it is a game about inevitability no matter the choice, the rapid shifts in character and time as a mechanical feature do little to encourage empathy. From the standpoint of narrative rather than gameplay, however, this structure is unique and works for its plot, if not its medium as an engaging interactive experience. Looking solely at the plot of the story and not the procedures relative to the player, the narrative elements work well for a fatalistic journey which would appear to be predestined, centering around a girl named Ali who will inevitably die in a car crash. While the crash is addressed from the first section with the frat boys, it is not until much later that we see that the stories are interconnected. While the gameplay itself can become stagnant and confused, the structure does make for a meaningful narrative twist concerning the inevitability of tragedy. Furthermore, the game's path may be traced and understood thematically through the symbolic use of color. Color symbolism is a large part of the narrative of Photopia. Each section of Ali's fantasy realm is depicted in a different colored text. Each part of real life is shown in ordinary black and white text. Each color corresponds with a different meaning or feeling from the preceding chapter of Ali's life, which is depicted out of order in the game but always ties back near to the present day with the story she is telling as she babysits. The psychology behind the perception of color plays a large part in the perception we have of this game. For example, Muditha Batagoda's article, Understanding Color Psychology Through Culture, Symbolism, and Emotion, describes the most common idea about the effect of colors on humans concerns the emotional experience they have had with that color, as humans perceive colors in different ways. While people have different experiences and psychological ties to different colors, we often share base ideas and reactions to colors through common interactions. While I won't go in depth into the symbolism behind every color, their use as a narrative function should be noted in correspondence with Allie's story and her life. Red for danger and warning, foreshadowed at the beginning. Green for life and beginnings at Allie's end. Deep blue for dangers past. Sky blue for endless possibility. Gold for beauty eternal and potential lost and buried below. Purple for Allie's queen, royalty and death and the loss of what may have been, helpless inevitability. White for life and the culmination of all colors and the culmination of Allie's life from start to finish, inclusive of the feelings involved from the colorful text of her story. In conclusion, it is difficult to say whether or not this game was effective in its purpose. The fatalistic storyline of inevitability and the disjointed nature of life was well executed narratively. As a game, the unicursal path and singular ending, however, did not make for a fulfilling experience. This said, we might say that Photopia succeeded as a piece of ergodic literature, as the interactive function was key to its telling, but failed as a game as its procedures of parser-based functions made the ergodic elements tedious. Thank you for watching.